tonight. We're thrilled to see you at Green Home NYC's September Forum. I'm Rhonda Hilario-Cagiat. I'm a volunteer with Green Home NYC. In case you're not familiar with us, we are an all-volunteer nonprofit organization that's been highlighting sustainability and energy efficiency in New York City since 2002. We're an organization run by a team of dedicated volunteers who run some pretty cool programs. Every month we present forums just like this one on a wide range of sustainability topics. Our Green Careers team presents workshops and panels for people looking to break into or transition within the sustainability industry. Plus, we present green building tours so that you can see sustainable and energy efficiency in action. Coming up in October, we'll have a forum on smart cities, and we invite you all to our volunteer meetup so that you can get to talk to all of us and learn more. If you want to stay in the loop on upcoming events and workshops, please sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social, and all the details you can find on our website at greenhomenyc.org. Tonight, so we've got some fantastic speakers lined up to lend their expert insights on the effects of climate change and what that means for our city. We'll have a Q&A session after all the presentations, so please hold on to your questions and we'll get to them toward the end. Okay, so let's get started. Johanna,
Hi everyone, I'm Johanna Lawton. I'm a project manager at Rebuild by Design. I work with communities and governments and private stakeholders, philanthropy, to think through climate adaptation challenges, primarily working towards collaborative processes that drive solutions, whether they're programs, policies, or projects revolving around climate adaptation. And just to give you a little bit more information about Rebuild by Design, we see ourselves sort of as a process that does all of that, that brings together communities with stakeholders and local leaders alongside local, regional, international expertise to solve a complex challenge. And I would say 95% of the time that's around climate adaptation, though we also work on a number of other challenges, whether it be COVID recovery, for example. And we do this primarily in three ways. The first being large-scale regional design competitions, and then smaller scale place-based initiatives where we drive a collaborative process to come up with a solution to a climate adaptation challenge. And then third, and what I'll mostly be talking about today, is our research and policy. And I would say all of our research really is with a strategic lens to think about how we can push the needle on climate adaptation. So before I get into actually some of the research to lay the framework for a lot of the other presentations we'll have today, I do want to give more context about Rebuild's origin story, especially because we're all here in New York City and our origin story is really integral to our DNA. So Rebuild by Design was actually launched as an initiative of the federal government in response to Hurricane Sandy. So this was nearly 11 years ago that Rebuild by Design was launched by President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Recovery Task Force, it's a bit of a mouthful, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development as a year-long design competition to rethink how to rebuild the region after Hurricane Sandy. And so this competition focused on New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, and the idea was to set aside $1 billion of post-disaster recovery funding to, for the first time ever, build forward instead of using federal disaster funds to put back exactly what had been there before. And so this innovative process was a time-bound design competition that brought together hundreds of community organizations, over 180 local, state, federal agencies, nonprofit organizations, universities to design and collaborate on projects that are now all at various stages of implementation around the region. We're going to be hearing about actually one of them later in a moment. And these projects are on different stages of implementation. They have over $4.3 billion invested in them, just demonstrating that when you have really innovative projects to address the climate crisis, they attract more dollars. And we've replicated this process in other areas, like in the Bay Area, to address the slower onset of sea level rise in a more proactive context. And we've also taken this to locations around the world on a smaller scale, doing place-based initiatives, everything from a town square to thinking through a comprehensive plan for a city. And so now to get a little bit more into the research side of what we do to sort of be the basis for all of our actual project planning and implementation. A lot of what Rebuild by Design does is in an effort to understand the impacts of climate change so we can begin to understand how we can design solutions. And I will say, admittedly, as a New Yorker myself and many of my colleagues being New Yorkers, I would say we're a bit biased towards our research focusing a lot on New York City, though we also like to use it as an opportunity to gut check what we know about New York communities and then replicate our research elsewhere. And so a few years ago, we did this mapping analysis to understand who lives currently in New York City's floodplain, so we can look at where people are still located in places that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy, but also who's living in the floodplain that will exist by 2100. And we also wanted to overlay some demographic data to understand exactly who it is that is being impacted by these climate hazards. And what we found is that currently over 1.3 million residents live directly within or adjacent to the coastal floodplain. And this number could rise to 2.2 million if left unabated by 2100. And when you look at the demographic information, we actually found that over half of the communities are considered low income by HUD. And then when you layer in looking at racial and ethnic data, we also found that 56% of the communities that are located currently in the floodplain are communities of color. But we know that it's not just people, it's also our houses, our livelihoods, our schools. And so one of our more recent research efforts, and I apologize, I know it's going to be a lot of maps for upfront, sought to understand exactly who is at risk of being displaced by this coastal hazard. So we put out this report called Climate Displacement in New York City, Making Space for Our Neighbors, that looks at the immediate impacts of coastal flooding, as well as some housing and rental data to understand who would be directly displaced by the hazard of coastal flooding itself, and then who might be indirectly displaced by the slow shift of populations inland and upland. And what we actually found is that 40% of New Yorkers are at risk of displacement. And then taking a step further, I would say for the past 10 years, a lot of our research has focused on coastal flood risks, but as you all know, as we've seen from hurricanes Ida, Ophelia, Henri, and many of the other unnamed events in between, New York City is experiencing a stark growing risk from heavy rainfall events. And so we recently put out this report that looks at actually recent home sales in flood risk areas. And what we found was from 2023 sales data alone, that $3.6 billion worth of home sales are currently located in places that are likely to flood by 2050. So what that means is if you are a 2023 home buyer, you're likely to experience flooding if you are in one of these locations before your mortgage is up. And so that's one of the ways that we're trying to think about this risk, is not just, okay, are you in, are you out, but like, what does it mean to consider flood risk in the time frame of, when your mortgage payments are due? Are you thinking about it when you, at a longer term horizon, perhaps when your children are going to college and you're ready to move? What are these different situations and the sort of considerations that homeowners are considering when they're thinking about their flood risk? And that's just to give you a little bit of how we're trying to tease out some of this data. So it's not just about the numbers, but it's also thinking about the real financial implications that households are experiencing. And so we've taken, I promise it's not all just the problem. We are also very much driven towards looking at the solutions for how we can address the increasing impacts from flooding. And in particular, in response to Hurricane Ida, we've done a lot of work to rethink how we can turn New York City back into a sponge, and so how we can address this sort of concrete jungle that we are all living in. The first report that we put out in immediate response to Hurricane Ida called on 20 experts to share recommendations across housing, data analysis, emergency response, for ways that New York City should respond immediately to ensure a similar event did not happen again. And then we did a deeper dive, interviewing a number of different agencies and community organizations to understand what the actual barriers were for New York to actually become a sponge, and why haven't we gotten there yet, and then propose a number of recommendations for putting us on a pathway to become a sponge. And then finally, we also did a business case analysis to understand the sort of return on investment for going green. And across this body of work, really the message is pretty clear. It can be distilled down to these 3 points: that we need to be starting with the most socially and physically vulnerable communities, and we need to create a massive investment in multi-benefit blue-green solutions. And then when we cannot go fully green, we need to prioritize solutions that provide benefits to communities every single day. And so when I'm talking about blue-green solutions, I'm talking about everything from green roofs to expanding the natural areas that are able to absorb water in our parks and our parking lots, looking at water storage and detention tanks. If you look outside the window, I think you could see all of these gray roofs, and I sort of want you to take a second to sort of imagine what this visual could actually be if we applied it to the scene outside, what New York City would actually look like if we were to introduce nature and green solutions, so that we can create health benefits, social benefits, economic benefits, as well as the environmental benefits for New Yorkers. And so a lot of what we're doing right now is trying to push for the introduction of green and nature-based solutions, because it also has a really positive return on investment for New York. We found that for, I think it's about 80% of New York City, every dollar invested in green infrastructure actually yields about a $2 return. So not only do these investments have benefits every single day to our health and well-being, green infrastructure can actually provide a great benefit to all of our pocketbooks as well. And so the last thing I'll say on this about how we can start to collectively work, I know Mallory is probably going to be talking a lot about what the city's doing, and so I'm not going into all of that, but I think in addition to what the city is doing and what the opportunity is for New York City at large, there's a lot that we as New Yorkers can be doing to, one, hold the city accountable, but also take our own actions to educate our community, to communicate risks, and to start implementing solutions in our own homes and neighborhoods. And so this great photo is from sort of both the end and the beginning of a process we call Rainproof New York City, which is a collective effort that's a combination of Rebuild by Design, One Architecture and Urbanism, and then also the City of New York working with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice and Housing Recovery and Operations to convene New Yorkers from all corners of the city, whether they are nonprofits or private sector, and to collaboratively come up with solutions to rainproofing New York. And so we held a 6-month collaborative process where city agencies and New Yorkers were working hand in hand to come up with solutions and presented their recommendations in a final symposium in June. And from that list of recommendations, we are now continuing to convene New Yorkers and build a greater movement around everyone playing a role in addressing every drop of rain that lands in New York. So I think I will send with that.
Hi everyone, I'm Tammy. Thank you for having me here. I am an associate. I'm a landscape architect and architect by training, but also an associate SK. And I'm here to tell you about Project Living Breakwaters. But before I start with the project, I'll tell you a little bit about our office. We are a landscape architecture practice here. office, as well as arborists and horticulturalists. There's 90 of us across 3 offices, New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco. We do work all across the U.S. and at various scale, everything from regional landscape visioning to like small-scale design and implementation of urban plaza and gardens. But really, I think, at least to me, what really kind of at the heart of all these projects are these 4 principles that we have hold dear. We prize collaboration, so and I would like to think that we collaborate well among ourselves within the office, as well with our stakeholder, our client, our architects and engineers and policy agency as well. We try to be ecological designer. We know that all living things are part of this intermeshing entanglements, right? And we try to design for both human and non-human species alike. Being ecological designer also means that we need to be system thinker. We understand that environmental system, urban system are all intertwined. Johanna kind of like outlined in her presentation as well. And kind of one intervention on one system really gonna impact another. And so we want to think about the system holistically and design for them in that holistical way as well. And then lastly, we do think of our practice, landscape architecture, as a form of activism, where we try to drive change to form and processes of our cities and landscape, so that it would turn them to drive them to become more resilient and also more joyful as well. And so that's why I was so excited to tell you about Living Breakwaters, because I really do think that those 4 principles are the cornerstone of Living Breakwaters project here. It's also an exciting time for the project. We finishing construction hopefully very soon this month, and you can see all 8 breakwater from the shoreline, as well as from the air if you fly into New York. And so what you see here in Tottenville, Staten Island, which is, by the way, one of the projects that Johanna mentioned that's won the Rebuilt by Design competition, is a work of so many people over the past 10 years. And so I won't go through everybody here, but we'll kind of mention them throughout the presentation as well. And so let's go back to the beginning a little bit. Johanna mentioned a little bit. So after Hurricane Sandy, the Department of Housing and Urban Developments launched Rebuilt by Design competition. And so SCAPE response to that is we gather a team of architects, landscape architects, engineers to come up with a proposal, which is the Living Breakwaters. Our proposal really is rooted in this desire to address the impact of coming storm and superstorm like Hurricane Sandy, but then at the same time balancing that requirement with the continuing need of our city to engage with the water. This is a way of life that has been ingrained in the Bay cultural landscape, right? It's a landscape that consists of not only exposed shoreline, but also waterfront community and nearshore ecosystem that support a wide variety of non-human species as well. And so, yes, the project is about risk reduction. It is about creating physical resilience, but it is also about creating ecological resilience and cultural resilience. It's also not just a living breakwater, but it's a layer approach to resilience. So we do have this series of breakwater at the near shore, attenuate wave, reducing erosion, but it also need to be combined with other treatment upland and along the water edge, such as wetlands restoration, upscaling the stormwater storage capacity, and also building scale solution. And so that all these physical resilient network would be combined with a layer of with social resilient infrastructure, so that such as emergency response centers, such as school, community centers, so that we can create this culture of resilience around the water edge. So here is our winning competition design proposal, a series of breakwater that kind of protect the shoreline of southern shore of Staten Island. And in 2015, it was announced that we won the project, and we started working for the project since. it's been 10 years. The project take on so many iterations, but what at the core of the project, the 3 goals that I mentioned really is the guiding principle for us. And so I'm going to talk about the project through the lens of these 3 goals. Here you see a lot of these photos after Hurricane Sandy and how these are images from Staten Island. You can see how the waves have completely pummeling the infrastructure and house and kind of knocked them off their feet. And if you look at the map, you kind of understand why this is the case, right? So the southern shoreline of Staten Island is located right across from what we call the New York Bight, which is where, what is it? Sandy and Rockaway kind of stick out and create a funneling effect that's kind of push wave and wind toward the shorelines right here. And so in response to that, we create a series of breakwaters. Breakwater doesn't keep the water out. It's allowed for water to go through, but what it does is that it dissipates the energy of the wave so that when the water on the other side of the breakwater would become lower and calmer, and therefore become less damaging to the infrastructure onshore. Another risk that is threatening the shoreline community of Staten Island is erosion. So studies show that it's about almost 40 acres of land have been lost over the past century because of erosion, and it's expected to happen more in this next decade. And so as this narrow stretch of land becomes thinner and thinner, that's also become more, the community who live along that edge also become more at risk, especially in these storm events. And so we also designed the system of breakwaters so that it can hold sediment and sand, essentially build back beaches over time by the way that how these structures kind of interact with the daily wave action. And so we do this through many iterations, right? We work with our engineer, Coley, and Acatus to go through so many different iterations of the layout for the breakwater system. And you can see here, this is shoreline change modeling diagram. Whatever in blue, those are areas where we were able to accrete sediment, so beaches become wider, and in red is erosion. So as iteration 19, 60% design, you can see that the design actually able to build back the beach for most of the stretch along the shore there. We also went through a lot of wave modeling to see how good the system at attenuating wave. And so like the design right now that is being built out in Tottenville, the wave that passed through the breakwater structure when it hit the shore is measured to be from 0 to 3 feet. So for context, during Hurricane Sandy, the highest wave that hit the shoreline is about 20 feet. So by bringing those waves down to 0 to 3 feet, it's really reducing the impact that those waves might otherwise have to the shore and the infrastructure. But we don't only really just design for risk reduction, right? We also design for habitat creation. And what does that look like? So we start that whole process with looking back at the history of this area, and we realized that the shallow sea of Tottenville still supports a thriving population of oyster and fish. But it's no longer the case because of overfishing, because of dredging, because of pollution. And so we were interested in bringing back some of this historical ecological function. We also know that a lot of young fish kind of like find habitat within the bay, and they would migrate down the Hudson River, stay in the bay, and then migrate out into the ocean as they become adults. So we thought that our project should also be able to support and provide habitat for these animals species. And so what do these young animals like? They like niches and they like complexities so that they can hide away from predator. They also marine species also love surface complexity. More surface area, like these photos you see here, because more surface area is more area for things to attach to and life to form, and more life need more food. We also look at a lot of precedent, naturally occur reef, places with a lot of biological activities, and we call this area between these reef structure, reef street. So marine species love them because, as a young fish, you can come in here, forage for food, and then if a predator comes, you can very quickly hide away in this rock structure. We also send our ecologists on the team out onto the site. We look at the surrounding area, see what lived here, what used to live here, what do they like, and then we make a catalog of all of the animal, or what we call our non-human client, the species that we would design for. So we have oyster, we have crab, so many different types of fish, and then we also kind of outline the kind of habitat and condition they refer. All that research came into help us develop the series of ecological design approach. And they range from the macro, right, like what's the form of the breakwaters. And I kind of wanted to bring your attention to these one here. This is the reef street, which is the kind of, these are the structure that mimicking the function and the form of the naturally occurring reef that I showed earlier. So they would add more complexity to the structure and allow for more things to thrive in there. Also, all the way, we're also adding more micro complexity by adding these ecological enhancing concrete unit, or what we call e-concrete unit for short. And that would, again, more complexity for the breakwaters. So here, a photo of the actual breakwaters out there. They're made mostly of stone, but the stone are also specifically chosen for their size, so that when they come together, they would create a diversity of space for things to hide in. And then in the front photo there, you can see these e-concrete tide pool, and they act similarly to these tide pool that you can see in rocky shore. They hold the water when it's low tide, and so it's create this condition for things like cockle and crab and algae to thrive in. Another photo of the reef bridge structure. You can see this whole arm thing kind of live in the intertidal zone. And so what that means is that it would be submerged during high tide and then exposed during low tide. You can see a bunch of tide pool unit kind of lay along there. And then underwater, we have armor unit stay there, located in that zone. And so after construction, the Billion Oyster Project will help us install more live oyster on this structure and increase the complexity of the design. So even though just during construction, we see thriving marine life already on the breakwater. We have seal, we have a lot of shorebird, and then underwater, you see crab, sponges, algae, and a different type of young fish as well. And so, I would think that enhanced ecological value bring a lot of social value as well, because they provide opportunity for education, recreation. It's also kind of collectivize the community over the pride for the land and water. And so that brought us to the last of the goal, which is building up social resilience. We define social resilience as building a community of support and stewardship around the projects. And so we thought a good way of doing that is engaging young people. We went through and identified the different schools along the shoreline here, along the site, and then invite them into to participate in the design process. We came into the classroom to tell them about the project. We engaged them through exhibition, shore walk, and citizen scientist project. These are the projects that we developed in collaboration with Bob, Billion Oyster Project. So if you haven't heard of them, this nonprofit organization. They work on oyster restoration and conservation for the harbor, but then they do so through partnership with education and also by engaging people in stewarding efforts. Which I think is such a wonderful way of achieving the goal, their conservation goal. And then so this diagram here kind of outlines the many different ways we collaborating with Bob. They will help us install oyster in the breakwater once it's finished construction. They're also going to help us with the long-term monitoring and adaptive management. And then we also collaborate with them on a lot of shore walk activities and educational initiatives that you can learn more about on our website as well. But so, the point is really to connect people to the water, to bring them to the water and build knowledge and skill and to teach the future generation about what does it mean to be here, to live here, and to protect the kind of environment that you care for. So I promise it's almost the end. The last part, making it real, right? We are 7 years from the beginning of Rebuilt by Design. We started construction in 2021, and now we're here just a few months away from the end of construction completion, but we are ahead of schedule. So you can see that the construction starts from the south to north. So the first 5 breakwaters is already substantially complete, and the last 3 is very close to be complete, hopefully this month. Work, this should have said 7 locations. So work is taking place in Tottenville, but then also work also taking place at all these other areas, right? We source stone from upstate New York and New Jersey. The e-concrete unit was produced in New Jersey, and then also all the other places where the stone were brought to and transloaded to different barges. So again, most of the stone come from upstate New York, from Harbor Quarry. It would be trucked down to Port of Cayman, and then from here, a barge would bring the stone along the Hudson River to the site. And then once it gets to the site, a crane, a GPS-run crane would place each stone one by one onto the breakwater, and then the same process go for e-concrete units. The design team, so it's us and COE, kind of go out there to do site visit about once a month since the project started construction, both underwater dive and above water walk. But then we relied on our amazing construction team, Bear and Bramble, construction manager, and Geeks, our contractor, to really kind of like bring this amazing project to life. And I'm just adding this photo because I really love how the reef bridge kind of look here. It's like dissolving under the rising water, the morning light. It's pretty too, even though human cannot be there, but I think it's nice. And also just like a reminder of, in the beginning there was a lot of doubt. People was like, there is no way seal gonna be there. But we saw so many of them, and it's so delightful to see them kind of like hang out on the breakwater. This is late winter, early spring is when they're in the harbor, and they seem to be having a good time. And then I will end the presentation here. We finishing construction soon. We have an activity, we have an event that planned for the public just to celebrate that milestone. So if it's free, we will have kayak, we will have food, we will have activity with Bob. So join us and scan this QR code to be there. Thanks, y'all.
That was such a fantastic presentation. I almost don't know how to follow seals. I'll never live up to how cute they look on those reefs, but I am so fortunate to have been able to go after Johanna and Tammy's great presentations, because I am going to be talking a little bit about comprehensive coastal flood protection, which is sort of just, a summing up of the things that we've already described. So my name is Mallory Rutigliano. It's nice to meet you all. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm speaking today sort of as a community practitioner from a lot of different perspectives. So I currently work for the New York City Mayor's Office of Management and Budget on a team devoted to environmental sustainability and resiliency, my focus being on resiliency to extreme heat and flooding. But in addition to that, I've also been working in the resiliency space as a volunteer with the grassroots organization, the Sierra Club, as our chair for our Hudson River Estuary Committee in New York State for 5 years now. So I've been working on resiliency projects before coming to the city. Just as a sort of disclaimer, I'm not here speaking on behalf of the City of New York today. All opinions are my own, but I'm going to speak a little bit from the backgrounds that I have, including those in city government and public service, and also in community activism, and I'm really excited to talk to you all today after this. So today I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about a particular case study in comprehensive coastal flood management that I know I've been following for a long time, and many of you maybe have been as well. The New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study, But sort of first an understanding of why we need sort of a comprehensive look, like Tammy was saying, sort of like a systems thinking approach related to coastal resiliency and resiliency in general, projects in New York City, in New York State, and beyond. And also the importance of nature-based and integrated solutions, which is also why I'm so happy to be coming right after Tammy's presentation. So similarly to how Joanna mentioned, the New York City floodplain is really complex and important. These are two maps pulled from the New York City Comptroller's Office 10 years after Sandy report, which came out a couple of years ago. But as you could hear from our presentations, we're still talking about that massive storm event. It meant a lot for our city, it meant a lot for the region, and we sort of for the first time, I think, really grappled with, as a region, understanding that we are at extreme risk on our coasts, from our clouds, from the sun, in many different ways, and this sort of shed a light on why we need both research and policy, as Johanna mentioned, in order to sort of combat this. So the New York City Panel on Climate Change is a body of independent experts and scientists that come together by mandate from the city to help sort of provide consultation services and expert assistance to understand our flood risks. So here are a couple maps that are pulled from that report, but they're hearkening to these scientific studies that have been done to project our floodplains. So as you can see, there's a lot of blue in our map of the 100-year floodplain and a lot of pink in the current and future high tides maps. Just sort of to level set what this sort of means, a 100-year floodplain is a measure of the intensity and the frequency of a storm of a particular type. So it may seem pretty intuitive, but a storm that kind of happens on a day-to-day basis because it's pretty small is likely to happen all the time. We get many rain events every year, as an example. We also get, coastal flooding events every year. We get high tides with every moon cycle, and those are really likely to happen. And so they, they're called like a 1-year storm or something that's likely to happen on the order of 1 year. Doesn't mean it necessarily will, but just sort of relatively. But then when you get to these bigger numbers, like a 100-year storm, it speaks to the intensity and sort of the relative frequency. So when we say a 100-year storm, it means a storm that, because it is so intense, it is only likely, probabilistically, to happen once every 100 years. We could get many of them in a shorter period of time, but this is just sort of a relative feature. So you'll see that in some maps and slides to sort of understand this. So if we're talking about storms that are really large, like a 100-year or a 500-year storm, storms sort of in the magnitude of Hurricane Sandy, we're seeing those become more and more frequent over time. And you might even notice that we get more of these sort of cloudburst-style rain events happening even inland. These are coastal maps, but even our inland precipitation is causing flooding at an increasing rate because we're getting more in less time, and our infrastructure just sort of can't handle it. And these events are happening more and more frequently. So we have about 520 miles of coastline in New York City. That's a lot. We have 5 boroughs, but we have a lot more coastline. And this means that many neighborhoods, like those that Johanna mentioned, including the environmental justice communities, communities of color, low-income communities, and many others, including things like business districts and commercial areas and transit hubs and hospitals, and all kinds of important infrastructure and residences are located within these floodplains, meaning that we're likely to see that they will have events either from coastal storms or, in separate maps, flooding from rain events, sometimes both. I mentioned the New York City Panel on Climate Change. They have put together projections and just released an updated report this past year that can help us understand sort of how our risk escalates. We have figures of our floodplain now, and we have also historic information on things like who was affected by hurricanes like Sandy, but we also need to know where we're going if we're going to plan ahead. So resiliency is kind of all about taking a look toward the future, not just at the present or the past. And so these kinds of projections are really useful for work like mine because we need to be planning for projects that may not even come to fruition for decades. Maybe they are large construction projects, or they're projects that will last a long time. They have a useful life that will, outlive the next few decades. And so we don't only need to prepare for what we know is going to befall us now, but also what we know we can anticipate reasonably with the science in the future when those assets will exist, when those people will live, and like Joanna mentioned, also when people will be paying off their mortgages, or maybe their children will. So by mid-range estimates, we can see that there is likely to be about 1 additional foot of flooding by the 2030s, which is right around the corner from these projections. And by the 2080s, which is also not that far away, we could see an additional 3 feet. If you picture that in terms of like water filling up a basement or water coming on shore, that's actually quite a lot and makes a really big difference in terms of design, building, and risk. But we have a lot of coastal protection projects. That's a good thing. They're underway, they're coming online, they're planned for the future, and we're still investigating more of them. This is a photo, for an example, from the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project that has been planned in phases to try to protect parts of lower Manhattan. And there are many projects that are coming on piece by piece to try to protect those many, many miles of coastline that we face. There are also many projects to handle inland flooding and heat, but as you can see, I'm mostly using coastal protections as an example. Because I want to talk about this New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study, or what we call HATS. This is a study that's been conducted by the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a federal branch of the military, and they had put together a regional evaluation after Sandy of what the flood risk looks like across the northeastern seaboard. And then they honed in on specific areas to focus, one of those being the New York, New Jersey harbor area. And this has sparked a many-year study to try to figure out how to propose and plan and eventually, hopefully, fund and see to fruition a suite of projects to protect our coasts. But those can take many different forms. So this is an example here, this photo of the New York, New Jersey HATS interim report that came out several years ago. This is all available online on the Army Corps' website if anybody's really interested in these types of projects. And we should be, because they are very long term, they have a long way to go, and they are not yet put in place. So there's a lot of room to, I guess, make new things happen for these projects, because even though we have coastal projects coming online across our shores, this study has not yet moved into the phase of being implemented, and I'll describe that a little more in a second. So as part of the report that came out recently, actually a few years ago now, from the Army Corps, they looked into what areas are at risk on the coasts of New York and New Jersey, and what possible proposals they could put in place to support large-scale coastal flood measures. And so this is a spectrum here of the types of instruments that they looked at. In water measures, things like tide gates that you move, flood barriers, as well as inland measures. And the numbers, the alts, are just the alternative proposed plans that they put in their report. They looked at 5 plus a no action scenario, basically what if we did nothing other than what we're doing already, ranging from fully in water measures to fully land-based measures or heavily concentrated in those areas, as well as mid-range estimates. The Army Corps put forward what they called a tentatively selected plan, a TSP, if you will, and they selected the one right in the middle, alternative 3B. This was basically the Army Corps' proposal to their non-federal sponsors, the states of New York and New Jersey, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, and their non-federal partner, the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice within the city of New York, what they think a reasonable project could be. So basically on the left here you can see the floodplains, again with the purpley blue being the flood extent. If you're having trouble orienting, it's Staten Island, Brooklyn, Manhattan, the Bronx, and New Jersey. And all of those areas that are in the purplish mirror the flood maps that I showed earlier. These are the flood extents that you would see coming on land during a 100-year event. And then on the right, you see their renderings for what a hypothetical, tentatively selected plan of coastal flood protection projects, which includes a balance of inland and in-water and on-land measures, would look like. So those pink would be things like floodgates, barriers on the shorelines, levees, dams, and other kinds of instruments. And then you can see where there's reduced purple behind those pink. So they're designed to sort of keep water from coming on shore. But the Army Corps is not done. They're still in the study phase. and they are currently working on evaluating the many public comment letters that they received in the most recent round of public engagement, because many community advocates feel that we should be incorporating more or less hardscaped measures. A lot of what the Army Corps has proposed, and what's implicitly sort of in those pink lines, which are just drawings on a map, but if you picture them on the ground, things like Living Breakwaters or other types of projects, or like an East Side Coastal Resiliency, most of them take the form of concrete walls or movable gates. They can have a lot of different motion, they can be stagnant, but they're relatively permanent. They're designed to be in place until the end of the century. They will cost about, according to at least the tentatively selected plan, which again might not be the suite of projects that actually gets put forward, to cost $53 billion and to be constructed over a 14-year period starting in 2030 as per the proposal. And there's, like I said, there's many different kinds of elements that are included in these projects. Not every line here is the same kind of measure, but even just the shoreline-based measures, which usually take the form of large walls blocking off the coasts, or things like raised promenades or esplanades that have elevation to stop the water from coming in, totals around 50 miles, which is a lot. All those lines look really small, but that's a lot of projects to sort of shore up our coastline, and we have to think very carefully about it. Many community advocates, such as those that I have worked with in the past, are very concerned about not incorporating from the get-go more natural solutions in order to make us more resilient, and acknowledging that we might need a balance of things like hardscape, concrete features to really keep out intense wave action, but also natural features to help us be more resilient and grow with the problem in different ways. So the Army Corps is working on, as far as I know, working on sort of those public comments, understanding them, internalizing them, and reassessing where they go from here in the study phase, and eventually to put forward a proposal that would incorporate these projects to get funded and then start to design and construct. So one of the sort of bits of good news, if we're thinking about the future of large-scale projects like these, projects on the order of billions of dollars, decades to implement, many, many miles of different kinds of protective barriers or measures, in addition to those that are already being worked on in concert, such as those we've heard about today, is that the Army Corps has a role in an international consortium that's putting forward guidelines on natural and nature-based features. So those are the kinds of measures that they would recommend make us more resilient because they're more systematic, they mimic natural systems, they work in tandem from the get-go with hardscape features, and they might not sort of be as one size fits all. So the Army Corps led as a partner with other international organizations and bodies as the International Guidelines on Natural and Nature-Based Features for Flood Risk Management, which indicates that from the get-go, from the time of studying and proposing and designing features, it's important to put forward natural solutions as a first pass, even with other measures, before sort of going ahead with hardscape proposals and then sort of tacking on natural features later on, which is honestly what the existing tentatively selected plan proposes. If anybody is interested in reading it, it's about a 600-page report, but you'll see very little in there on natural features from the get-go. They focused a lot on the hardscape engineering up front, which in some ways is necessary. We need to sort of understand what we need to handle really massive amounts of water along many, many miles. But many individuals and experts are concerned that we need to sort of be following the Corps' own guidance and putting nature-based solutions at the forefront first and foremost with other types of measures, so that we can make sure that we're introducing complexity into the systems that we're building, because they're long-term, they need to be future-looking, and we need to make sure that we're sort of using all of the best practices we can and learning from nature and the systems that we know are efficient at managing water and our risk in order to keep us protected, as well as providing co-benefits for things like recreation. So no resolution on this topic. We'll see how it unfolds. If any of you are involved in coastal organizations or projects, this is definitely a place to watch. it's important to have federal bodies, state bodies, city bodies, local organizations all engaging at the various levels on big projects like this so that we can sort of take a holistic look at our risk landscape and where we are going to reduce our exposure to that risk, but also making sure that we keep an eye on what those best practices are and trying to aim really high as we implement something. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much to our panel for some great presentations. Anyone have a question for our panelists?
I had a question. I think most of our, is it Johanna?
Mm-hmm.
From Johanna, but also like everyone. So you guys talked about like larger scale blue solutions, and you had mentioned, I think, the spectrum of green solutions and blue solutions. And I'm curious, what are examples? Like, I'm familiar with the ideas of like green roofs, and when it's like tree beds. I don't remember what the term is. Oh, bioswale.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
bioswales, tree pits.
But what are there examples of like smaller scale blue solutions that aren't like that are things that we can see like around the city, not like a giant wall?
Yeah, I think I get this question maybe the most because I think like a lot of people are like, I'm a renter in New York City. What realistically can I like start to do to actually have a tangible impact without physically changing the landscape of a building? I just say it was sort of like the very small things are like behavioral changes actually to living with water, understanding that a lot of the flooding that occurs during these heavy rainfall events and like high tide events is because we have a really outdated sewer system in New York City. It's 100 years old, and it just can't process the amount of water that we have. So when you think about every interaction that you have with water during a heavy rainfall event, whether it is taking a long shower or doing your laundry or running a dishwasher or doing your dishes, I think like even things like that, I consider blue solutions because I think of them as like there are really small, tangible behavioral changes that we can do that have an immediate impact. And then from there, there's always things like literally having a potted plants out on your, I don't know if you can put them on your fire escape, maybe that's not allowed. But I still think literally every drop that can be absorbed instead of running off into our sewers is a solution. And so there's actually a really cool example from the Netherlands of an actor who put I don't know what you'd call it, like a flower bed on the top of his car as an example of like, look, anything can absorb water and anything can educate people about how every drop counts.
I don't have a car, but
Yeah.
if I did, I would put a flower bed on it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Gregory, any question?
I sometimes like to ask in situations is sort of a wish list. Now, not overall, but for each of you, like if there's one thing that like changed tomorrow that realistically could happen that would really like advance the efforts that you're advocating for, working on, working with, etc. What's something that comes up for you? Something that could be different tomorrow to really move things fast or further.
Sure, I can start. Yeah. So, I mentioned that I work in the budget office on a climate team. And, part of what I think about a lot is how we interact with projects, like what we've all talked about, but in terms of dollars. Not that we should be reducing benefits that we get for things like, human ecosystems, down to just sort of dollars and cents. But at the end of the day, how do we, work to spend our money as productively as possible in terms of environmental benefit, right? Like if there's only so much to go around, how do we handle safety, housing, health, climate, all at once? So I think in terms of resiliency work that's going on, we know that it's going to be a really big lift, whether it's infrastructural projects, whether it's behavior change, whether it's moving people out of risky areas so that they're safer or helping them get design strategies so that they can reduce their risk. And so I often think sort of from the budget perspective of if I could wish for one thing, it would be a system, which we're in part working on with the city, but I won't go into that too much, a system in order to make sure that every dollar that we're spending is getting the absolute best benefit that we can for that dollar, and if not, what else could we do with it? What else could we co-opt in a project or a funding solution or an initiative to make it reach more people, do better, provide longer term results? And so I think I'd go in that direction of like management and foresight.
Okay, so maybe it's somewhat related, but it has to do more with regulation and policy maker, right? I'm a landscape architect and architect, so a lot of the time that we work with the regulation that has been set out by the cities and the state. And I wish that, like maybe there's some more priority onto conservation and preservation and, protecting the natural resources that we have, and less on, for example, we're working to actually bringing oyster to the breakwaters, and I think we're working a lot with the Department of Environmental Conservation, and it has been such a long process, and to bring these breakwater onto to what it is now take so much permitting and regulation, and which is a good thing. We need them to kind of like help us make sure that the thing that we do is correct. But I also wish that there's also understanding that hey, we're trying to do nature-based solution, we're doing things that are innovative, and there's has been a lot of research done on this project that should help push the needle in a way that the city and the state should maybe support. And then on the flip side, I also wish that there would be more regulation on development around the city, where would kind of like control maybe a little bit of overrun development, and or kind of incentivize developer to do more of nature-based solution, or like more planting, more just things that would work for the whole community and the city in general.
I would say political will. I mean, I think that there's really, really incredible people that I've had the pleasure of working with across every city agency who care so much about this, but I do think there's a level of leadership at the very top that you need to have that says like integrates all the strategies that every agency is doing, ensures that there's continuous institutional collaboration across all of them. And the reality is like we are still building things that do contribute to the problem, whether it is certain types of roads or medians that aren't also a solution. So I think like just actually having that sort of executive forward approach that's looking at this as like really one of the city's greatest priorities.
Okay, thank you all.
Love hearing about the Breakwaters project. Are there other ones that we can look out for or be excited about as they come online or under construction?
Yeah, they're all different stages. So within New York City, one of the winning concepts from the Rebuild by Design competition is the Big U, which is all of that coastal protection along the southern tip of Manhattan, and that has since been, it was compartmentalized based on certain natural pinch points in the floodplain, and all those projects now live in an alphabet soup of different acronyms, from the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, the Seaport Project, Battery Park Coastal Resiliency Project. It's all actually now a bit more of a J, because it was supposed to be a full U up to 59th Street on the west side, and it actually stopped at Chambers Street, where state property continues on, and that's a section that's actually under the territory of the HATS study currently. But you can see parts of the East Side Coastal Resilience Project if you start at 25th Street on the east side, going down the FDR to about 14th Street. That section is, I think, complete. And then continuing down, you can actually see some of the construction that's going on in those projects. I think, actually, if you want to take a quick trip over to Hoboken, there's an incredible series of stormwater resilience parks. They built their Rebuild by Design project is a combination of delaying floodwaters from coming onto land, absorbing water on land, and then discharging water as quickly as it can back out into the river. And so they have already opened up 3 stormwater resiliency parks that capture, I think it's about 9 million gallons of water And so you wouldn't really notice that they are a solution if you went there any given day. It looks like a beautiful park with a playground. They have community programming there. And last year, actually, during Hurricane Ophelia, when New York City was still digging itself out of flooding and mold and all the residue from that event, that neighborhood was dry by like 3 p.m. I think reporters went out there looking for a story and there wasn't one. Everyone was like, yeah, we already have trash collection coming. So it's one of those examples where like really successful projects you actually don't hear about because they're doing well. Yeah.
Just off of that question, how do you guys feel about the unified stormwater rule as like a collective, like architects and policymakers? Do you think it'll actually have good environmental benefits for the funds?
Maybe repeat that question one more time. Sorry.
Do you know if this unified stormwater rule where all the buildings that are being formed now have to detain all their stormwater and manage it within the property? I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly, but like it sounds like something that would have great environmental benefits if it's actually enforced. But as an architect or a policymaker, do you like actually see any benefits coming before 2080?
I do think that those are great regulation. I'm not exactly sure that they have to store on the stormwater, but the stormwater have to be treated before it's go into the street. But I also, as a landscape architect, I actually support that kind of regulation, right? I think we do need to put. I think landscape architect and architect can do a lot. Can do a lot with design innovation if we are forced to. So and developer can as well. So if there are those regulations, I think we can work together to figure out a different solution. And I think solution for like keeping water on site, to treat water on site before releasing back into the sewer system. We have those solution and design solution already that could make that work. And yeah. Totally support as I mentioned earlier.
I would tend to agree. I think generally it's a great direction to go in, but I do think one thing that we still haven't quite figured out is how to incentivize capturing not just the water that's on your own property, but adjacent properties. There are certainly big box development stores all across the city that could be huge assets for storing water and could do a lot more if that water was then collected in certain places. So I think there's an element that we need to have of like creating incentives and regulations on existing properties or retrofitting properties and new ones, but again, pushing it a little bit further.
I was going to say something similar to like the unified stormwater rule, for those who don't know, basically requires that properties that are sort of making impervious surfaces through like new construction, for example, of, I can't remember the threshold, I think it might be something like 20,000 square feet, have to then manage it on site, a certain amount or proportion. I think it's a great start, right? Like it's wonderful to be able to say like, okay, you can't just, take something that's green, maybe pave over it because it's private property, and then, just enjoy that you don't have to deal with the stormwater anymore. It's a good step, but like Johanna said, it doesn't handle new existing property, and that's where so many issues are, like big parking lots or large roofs. There's programs through the city like the Green Infrastructure Grant Program. There's also Local Laws 92 and 94, I think, of 2019, part of, in the future, 2019, part of the Climate Mobilization Act that requires green or cool or solar roofs. So like all those things help add benefits. But I agree, we need to be making sure there are programs to say, hey, if you put something that holds like a ton more water, or you're in it, or to even alert properties, you're in an area that's high flood risk from something like stormwater, where people aren't maybe as aware because it's kind of a newer emerging issue than things like coastal risks. How do they know that so that they can then plan proactively?
Question. Building off of what you guys were saying, in regards to, like you're saying, in being able to store water, being able to store water, it sounds as if, it it's very interesting that you're saying that, because I'm thinking about the older buildings, how they used to be able to collect water, and the fact that you were actually looking toward doing those projects, are those projects coming in at any point in time? Say,
So I think maybe are you referring to like the rainproofing sort of solutions? Right now, these are really just recommendations for figuring out like when we put agency minds and community minds together, like how can we start thinking through solutions. We actually have seen a very organic group emerge from this greater citywide process in Flatbush that's actually trying to implement some of the solutions, but nothing yet.
Okay, and regarding, I'm gathering, there's a technology out there that's called, technology, regarding permeable sidewalks.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Permeable
something-
pavers?
Yeah, is that
Yeah.
something that's actually being implemented?
Oh, yes. Yep.
It has?
Yeah, so we use them almost on all of our projects, and I wanted to be like maybe 50% sure that it's required on a lot of city public projects now. So what that is that these are usually you see it on sidewalk, right? These paver, but what it does is that the technology is the way that these aggregate are being compact to become the paver itself, allow for water to seep through, and that would recharge the water table underneath. So yeah, instead of water being flowed directly to sewer, it would actually seep through and get into underground. Yeah.
Streets.
It's being used in streets.
Yeah.
Is it actually better than the tarp version? More stronger, not more strong, but just more.
It's like structural. Are they structural?
Yeah, and actually in that sense, it actually could be something that's the word, building thing right there on top of that. But yeah, is it any bigger?
It's definitely better. Yeah, well, in my mind, a lot of people are going to have different perspective, but I think because of these regulations that you have to manage and treat certain amount of water on site rather than releasing it to the sewer, we using these kind of technologies as a solution
On that
for that now.
when it comes to regarding even treating water, which is really a good thing. And you guys, is the idea of composting, just curious, ever come up? Is that subject regarding?
Sorry, which idea?
Just reducing the amount of water composting, in a sense. Not sure.
Like water reuse systems, things that you can then use like gray water, you know, like if you took it in from your roof and then use it in toilets, things like that. Is that what you're talking
That's
about?
one aspect of it, yeah, that's one aspect of that, just was wondering if they did that. Yeah. Generally. But I know the topic of composting is coming up with buildings, and I know they can only do so much.
Right.
And they can only handle so much because they got like a lot of things that they're juggling. But yeah, that the fact of buildings having to be able to have having that option of being able to manage their own water, gray water as you put it.
All right, Crystal, you had a question?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to articulate a little bit about when you're asking about the rain and the rainproofing. I also have been jotting notes because I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase it. Because these, basically, I'm not sure if this is touching on what you're saying with the rainproofing, but from everything we've heard today, I feel very impressed because it sounds like these projects are massive and in terms of size, scope, and budget. At the same time, we've heard some actual tangible finished results, like the Breakwater project is constructed. So I'm trying to understand, is it that our three panelists have brought success stories to us, or am I just not really like understanding how challenging these projects are? And I wanted to know if you can, if you want to talk about the rainproofing example or any projects that you have worked on, to give me a better feel of how difficult it is to get these projects to the finish line, and when you get them to the finish line, are they actually what the teams actually wanted from the beginning? All three of you.
Maybe I can start with Living Breakwaters, right? It has been 10 years. And I've been working on the projects for the past 3 years. Before me, there's countless of scaper and people who work at our engineer office working on it. And if you see our drawings, the folder is insane. There's just so many correspondence, so many drawings, and then the permit document that is public and online, if you print it out, it's like this large. There's 10 folder. And so yes, it actually takes so much work. And then if you talk about it, but I think again, right, I was saying, over 10 years, there's so many iterations of the form of the project, but if you set out and have the goal in mind, this is, it has to be physical risk reduction, it's ecological resilience, we build social resilience. As long as those goals that you set out in the beginning always been achieved, I think that kind of bring a sense of success to you. And I think there is also what Living Breakwaters I think did right. And when it did right, it's just a whole collective of people. There was so many people involved in that project. I think that is because it's garnered a lot of support from the communities. Over the years, we have so many people coming up to us and tell us about because we have these meeting earlier in the design phase, and these kids who show up to these events that you see in the photo as a student, and then now they graduated and they come and work as intern in one of our offices. This is it has been taking so long, and the generation have been going through and being part of the project. And so yes, maybe I didn't talk so much about those details, but yes, it's in there. It's big in the process that is hard and long and endures. But then as long as you have a group of supporters and you work together, I think it's possible.
One of my favorite photos is of the Living Breakwaters binders of permits. It's this wide of paperwork, and of course it's an incredible opportunity now to see them come to life, but I'm sure for 10 years doing all of that, that's what people are up against all across the city. It's incredibly difficult to permit and build in water. That's why you see a lot of things get moved onshore, because as soon as you start acting in water, and not to mention just our hodgepodge of ownership between city and state land, and also an influx of federal resources, I think there certainly is a reason why we haven't seen more projects come to fruition at this large of a scale. Of course, there's things happening around the city on every street corner, in a lot of neighborhoods. We're already seeing New York City stand up a housing buyout program to relocate people out of harm's way. We're seeing really big long-term thinking, but I think the reality is it probably will be 10 to 15 more years before we see a lot of this planning that's happening now come to life.
And just to put my community advocacy hat on for a minute, there are so many successes, but it can be a real slog. Even from the community perspective, there's so many times where there are projects that get proposed and they just aren't quite right. And community members have to put in a lot of effort in order to build coalitions, work with lawyers, work with designers, work with nonprofits, people willing to give expert time pro bono in order to try to make the project better. And there are plenty of projects that probably aren't improved as much as they should be, and there are plenty of projects that also then kind of go leaps and bounds because of that engagement. So from the perspective of the first time that a project is introduced, not the ones that we've been talking about necessarily, but any kind of project that has any influence on our resiliency, things like hats, which have seen a lot of public comment, there's this lengthy process of trying to get it right even before you kind of can go through the construction process and permitting and all of that. And seeing it firsthand, sometimes it's years of coalition building and pushing back and trying to balance between the very weird gray area of getting something that we need as soon as we can and making sure we don't lock in something that is not ideal. It's hard to balance the perfect and the good and to know when to push and when not to push. So for everybody, I think, who's involved in this kind of work, it often feels like a lot of failures before a success.
Gregory in the back.
ask about insurance industry. Now it gets attention with like California. Oh, cash spiral all the time. Insurance pulling out of the state. Or Florida, insurance pulling out of that state with all the flooding, being hit by hurricanes regularly, making the state to be sort of the insurer of last resort. What I don't hear as much about it, I hear that sort of thing slowly creeping up the East Coast in a way. Are you seeing, hearing, know about something within that sphere that's relevant here in the New York area and to like the work that you're all doing? I don't assume so, but I think there could be something that maybe we don't know about.
Flood insurance is a really tricky topic because there are requirements. So if you have a federally backed mortgage and you live in the delineated FEMA floodplain, you are required to have a certain amount of flood insurance. That can be delivered through FEMA, through their National Flood Insurance Program, including sort of via private lenders or insurers, which is what you're talking about. Yeah, we've definitely seen this move where some areas are being deemed like uninsurable. I wouldn't be able to speak to whether or not that's actively happening in New York State, but I wouldn't think it's not a risk. We have high property values in many ways. We have a lot of flood extent and risk, and things like insurance value and the recurrence of those storms, like what I was mentioning earlier about recurrence intervals, like the 100-year storm. The 100-year storm of 50 years ago is not the same as the 100-year storm today, nor is it the same as the 100-year storm in the future. And oftentimes things like our flood maps take a long time to update. And so we're not seeing necessarily the sort of guidance on things like financial assistance match up with the timeline of real scale climate change. And that's where things like what Johanna was mentioning, like housing mobility programs come in. There might be places that need to be relocated or need to have a new plan or sit behind a flood barrier because maybe otherwise it would be uninhabitable or uninsurable and protectable. I don't know of a case study in New York off the top of my head, but it is certainly a real concern. And for anybody who's interested, there's really interesting research coming out of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, oftentimes on flood insurance and the ways that sort of premiums interplay between different regulatory environments, because different states actually have different regulation on insurance and flood insurance, which makes things even trickier.
I would also add to that, I think outside of flood insurance, I think the insurance industry at large needs to be part of the solutions, because currently they're sort of writing our de facto climate migration map across the US. And one of the things that we've been really advocating for a lot with coming out of our research to understand the impacts of climate change is how states can start to establish state level funding to invest in their infrastructure. And we think that the insurance industry is a really great tool to use, in particular looking at property and casualty insurance. So everything from insuring your home, your car, your boats, or agriculture farm, whatever it may be. And one of the models that we've been actually pushing for is a small surcharge on property and casualty insurance, which for New York, for example, could raise $16 billion over 10 years and come out to about $2 per policyholder per month. It's like just in one example of a solution that could be utilized. It's a lot more than the $4.3 billion we got out of the New York State Environmental Bond Act, which we also were huge advocates of. But there are a lot of solutions like that being thrown around. Parametric insurance is another thing that I think a lot of people are thinking about. And I will say there's a lot of great events actually next week that are delving into insurance. So I would give a shout out to the organization Insure. It's like INNSURE, Insure. They do a lot about innovative insurance models.
Okay. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So I think you were talking a little bit about how all of these kind of resilient, right? It's like a very gray area in the sense that there's a lot of ambiguity on from the community, from public stakeholders, and then probably from the private markets too. So just thinking about like the definition of resilience here, like I imagine in each of your different organizations, there's a different definition for it. So how do you think that having a kind of aligned definition across kind of like, again, public and the private sectors, like would enable to, improve how we tackle the problem?
That's such a good question. I feel like all of us might have a slightly different definition of resilient. I have mine, and I think, and also, that's like also SCAPE as an organization, we work with a lot of resilience planning project, and in my mind, and I, because I was taught by Pippa and Kate, which is like the ability of a place, a city, a group of people to adapt and thrive, and be prepared for changes. And so I'm actually would be curious to hear your definition, and then maybe we can discuss what.
I actually think we do use a very similar definition of the this ability to adapt and thrive. Though I will say, especially coming out of the pandemic, that there's been a sort of step away from using the word resilience and leaning on adaptation, just because we saw that so much of during times of crisis that especially communities of color and low-income communities are often described as resilient for enduring an event, and it puts a lot of the onus on that community to get through it, whereas I think like we try and are now looking more towards adaptation as sort of like what is the collective actions that we as communities and institutions and government agencies taking to respond to and build a better future.
Yeah, very, very similarly to me, resiliency is the ability for us to not only sort of quickly and successfully and healthily recover from an event, but it's our abilities to predict and avoid as well, whatever that means, whether that's housing mobility, whether that's, protective measures, whether that's, community support in order to have this sort of adaptive capacity. The goal is obviously for nobody to ever be at risk, but that's unrealistic. And so I think that predictive nature is really important. It's as we get more and more events and the events get more and more intense, it's going to be more people and area that's impacted. And so I think the more we can think proactively for different kinds of scenarios, the more resilient we are, because then we can know sort of when this thing happens, what do we do first, what do we do second, what do we do after, and that part is like the later. The least rebuilding, the least, recovery possible, the better kind of like rebuilds, motto to be trying to think proactively and future looking, I think is, really how we become resilient to the future.
To me also, like this question of risk or this definition of risk is also interesting, right? And personally, I do think that we all have to kind of get used to a certain level of risk and understand what that is, and also again like readapt our way of living to accept that, okay, this is the level of risk that I'm taking by living here in New York or by living here along the shoreline. Will I be willing to do that? And if I do that, what does that mean for the people around me or for the system around me? And yeah, I think there's a way for us to live with the water, and there's a way for us to build with the water that way.
Yeah, we have time for a few more questions. Go ahead, Louis.
Hi, I'm Louis. I'm interested in this balance between nature-based solutions and hardscaping, because one thing that comes to mind is that nature-based solutions, people like them, but they might take a bit longer to kind of fully grow to their maximum potential, like you're explaining. And of course, we know that with climate risks getting more frequent, more severe, we might actually need some of the kind of concrete behemoths to kind of protect communities. So I'm wondering about, what are the downsides of nature-based solutions, and do you think to kind of move less thinking about nature good, man-made bad, and think more about hydrants, like getting like the breakwater?
I would definitely say there's actually probably, I would say definitely more benefits than downfalls to nature-based solutions or natural solutions, especially when you're thinking about things like sewer upgrades and some of those hard infrastructure solutions that we will also need in time. I do think nature-based solutions generally, aside from a really massive investment like breakwaters, do happen a little bit quicker in New York City, but the thing that we haven't really figured out particularly in the way the city's budgeting is like the maintenance component, and how, you know, how we are not just putting a burden on communities who are then on the hook to maintaining all these solutions. And so figuring out different types of workforce models is like a really big thing I think a lot of organizations are figuring out at the moment. But I do think also a lot of times when we're talking about green infrastructure solutions, they are pretty highly engineered solutions that have sort of a mix of figuring out exactly like how, you know, what level of risk they can have and what the absorption and what the amount they can store and then delay and then discharge into our water systems. So even though they involve natural components and greenery and different, you know, species habitat creation, they may still be very engineered.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I would say as well. Like nature-based solution are engineers and designed, right? So usually, you know, you can think of it as a hybrid of green and gray infrastructure together. So we learn from nature, we incorporate all of these design feature, but is at the end of the day, is engineer and design solution. It is not separating nature versus man. And in my mind, like I also disagree with that dichotomy as well, which I assume most people at this point would agree with. Like there is no distinction, and we are part of nature anyway.
Actually, I was just curious because I was thinking, going back to we were saying about gray water, and I was like, I forgot that you mentioned in regards to redoing the piping of the sewer system. So I'm saying that would be something interesting because I was wondering if you guys there's ever been any research or development, I don't say development yet, but regarding like saying a natural based version regarding the sewer system in a sense of the piping, because that's something that is, I think it's something that'd be interesting to be looking into. That's like really like a whole transition.
And I think there are a lot of actually really cool projects happening across New York City to sort of replicate what the sewer can do in natural form. I am not an expert on blue belts or daylighting. Maybe one of you can speak to that, but I think like there are some really cool examples. And I think you mentioned you were from the Bronx. If you go to Tibbetts Brook in the Bronx, there's a cool example or look up what the city is doing. I don't know how far it's gotten, but essentially using more of a natural approach towards containing and conveying water.
Yeah, so a lot of our sewer or a lot of our stream now so New York is full of natural stream back in the day, right, in Manhattan day. And then over time we turn them into sewer and like hard line of everything. And so Tibbetts Brook is one of the projects. Tibbetts Brook is where they daylighting us and they open up the sewer and kind of renaturalizes so that it's also still conveying water, but at the same time in a more natural ways rather than just like directing water directly out to the rivers.
I'd definitely like to find where they do those on the streets.
There's a map
streets.
online.
Wow.
The Department of Environmental Protection has a map called the Green Infrastructure Map on their website, and you can see the locations of rain gardens, biospheres, green roofs, cloudburst hubs. I'm not sure about daylighting, but definitely blue belts. There's the daylight big projects in the Bronx, and you can see permeable pavement in there as well.
That is one more hand. One last question. Go ahead, Jack. One last question.
Yeah, so how do you balance like long-term thinking, like large-scale projects, with like policymakers who are often like looking for solutions that they can check off within their tenure? Is that something that you run into in like any of the different projects, making it more difficult or easier?
Okay, I guess I could talk a little bit about the experience with Living Breakwaters. I think what we benefited from in the project is that we, at least we started to find out that, you know, like our project managers, Kate and Kate, are maybe one of the very few people who has been in the project from the beginning to the end, and so we hold a lot of institutional knowledge on the project. And also, of course, our community, actually amazing, our community partner, like our citizen, CAC, Citizen Advisory Committee, are the people who have been involved in the project from beginning to end. But then, on our client side, there has been many different project manager in in the permitting agency, Department of Environmental Conservation, USAC. There's a lot of people who have been involved in the project and did not know any of the project background. So a lot of times is involving like reminding people like, oh hi, like this is the project history, this is the background. You agreed to this last year, or you agreed to this 5 years ago. We have this permit written here, but like I think things just hard. I feel like just sometimes you just accept that it's hard and you do it anyway. Yeah, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I think we come up against it all the time. And one example, one of our projects is currently working to work with communities to inform New York State's environmental Bond Act funded housing mobility program. So essentially buyouts across the state. And so we've been working a lot with communities in northern Queens in particular that experienced flooding during Hurricane Ida and before and after. And I think rightfully, a lot of electeds are concerned about meeting their constituents' immediate needs too. And I think for anyone who's having a conversation about long-term planning, it often almost feels like you can have it with those who are privileged to not be suffering right now. And that is like a really challenging issue. And one way that we actually have sort of bridged working with communities in some longer term thinking is by partnering with faith-based institutions, which has really been a great way to engage communities across the city, because a lot of faith institutions are thinking about their stewardship for the long term and whatever their community may look like for decades. And so I think sometimes working with political leadership is not the most effective route, though it is a great way to get to know people within a community. And then I will also say, I think to that point about this knowledge that exists over the lifespan of these projects, Living Breakwaters, 10 years, the other Rebuild by Design competition projects, some are still being constructed, some have not even broken ground yet. And the Army Corps project, that is still in planning and design, and then I think it has a 6-year design timeline and a 14-year construction timeline as currently planned. And so we're talking about something that'll be built in the 2030s with community input from this one round of feedback that happened over the course of like 9 months. And so really ensuring that there is stakeholder involvement from the beginning for a good project ensures its life. It ensures that it continues on throughout multiple administrations or different local leadership. It also holds the project accountable to the original intentions and values.
Yeah, actually, if I can add to that, that's why the social resilient aspect of the project actually is one of the goals, but it's also one of the reasons why the project is successful and lasts until now, I believe, because we were able to build a coalition of support around the project, a community support around the projects that, every time we come back, like all the CAC, the committee, the citizen committee always, kind of remind us like, hey, you told us to do this, or like they would remind their elected official that, hey, the project is important, we want that done. And that's kind of support have, help the project to be what it is now. So.
Valerie, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers it. It's difficult to balance, but I think, even though the struggle continues in terms of long-term, short-term, there's an understanding, I think, now in the zeitgeist of policymakers and civil servants and designers and engineers and community members that this is a long-term haul. This is a big series of projects, but like if we're thinking of it in the grand scale, this is a big project for our city to be conceptualizing. I almost feel like the new struggle is how do we manage multiple things at once. So if we realize that we're going to be planning for projects that are, 20, 30 years out, that's great. If we get buy-in in those projects, we keep them, kind of held to account and we incorporate the things that we should. But then there's this whole other level of we're facing many things at once. We're facing multiple climate-related crises. We're facing issues related to economics and standards of living and housing. We're facing other issues that have existed in the city for a long time related to things like equity. And how do we try to make sure that we're handling multiple things at once, so that for the projects that we know are going to be, 20 years down the line, we don't wind up in 20 years going, we probably should have done more than just this, or this is a great project, but what about that other thing that's been getting worse simultaneously? So how do we handle things like heat, rainfall, coastal flooding, housing issues, right? Like if you're seeing more and more water coming in from the coasts and we already have a housing problem, what do we do, right? Those are two things that are directly conflicting. So those types of like systems and design thinking problems, I think, is kind of where the big issue in mentality is pivoting, even though of course there are still some issues related to long and short-term thinking. But to me it's now more like one-track mind versus complexity thinking. And so we have to keep putting the pressure in to get as many things done simultaneously as we can, instead of allowing for compartmentalization, which becomes so easy for people when they're already dealing with something like a really long and complex project.
So that concludes our Q&A. I want to thank our panelists and all of you for a great discussion tonight. Thank you all for coming.